HOA Karen tears down my Christmas lights and finds me. 'Twas the season to be jolly, or so I thought until I crossed paths with our stupid infamous HOA Karen. Little did I know that my festive decorations would become the epicenter of a neighborhood drama that would rival any holiday blockbuster, including Elf and Die Hard. Sorry, Will and Bruce. It all began innocently enough. I'd spent the better part of a weekend meticulously stringing up my Christmas lights. It took forever, turning my home into a twinkling wonderland of holiday cheer. The warm glow of these lights was enough to make even the Grinch crack a smile and grow his heart a few sizes. But as they say, all good things must come to an end, especially when there's a batcrap insane HOA Karen lurking in the shadows. The trouble started with a seemingly innocent knock on my door. I opened it to find Karen, the self-appointed guardian of all things aesthetic in our HOA, standing on my doorstep with a witch-like scowl on her ugly face. Hey, wait a second, I thought Halloween was over. Your Christmas lights are a violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic standards, she declared, her voice dripping with ooze like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Yeah, she's a mutant. So I chuckled nervously, thinking that she was making an early attempt at humor. But no, Karen was dead serious. These lights are an eyesore. I can't have my property value plummeting because of your tacky decorations, she continued, her eyes darting from the festive lights to me as if I were the Grinch himself. I had tried to reason with her, explain that I had followed all of the guidelines outlined by the HOA. Now, as much as I hate on my HOA, I knew I had to play this one by the book. The lights were tasteful, not too bright, and certainly not an affront to anyone's property value. But Karen was having none of it. She huffed and muttered something about a formal complaint and stormed away, leaving me bewildered in my own doorway. I just couldn't fathom how a few twinkling lights could set off such a reaction, but it wasn't long before the full extent of Karen's idiotic ranting and actions became a reality to me. A week later, I received a sternly worded letter from the HOA claiming that I had violated the neighborhood's aesthetic standards by having excessive and garish Christmas lights. Apparently, Karen had not only filed a complaint, but had taken it upon herself to photograph my house as evidence. What? So I'm furious and feeling unjustly targeted. I decided to double down on the holiday spirit. I invested in even more lights, carefully selecting each bulb to comply with the HOA guidelines. This time, I even added a tasteful inflatable Santa and his reindeer on the front lawn, hoping to spread some cheer that even Karen couldn't resist. Little did I know that Karen wasn't about to let me one-up her. It was like a twisted game of cat and mouse, only with Christmas lights and neighborhood politics. So one evening, as I sat sipping cocoa and admiring my newly enhanced holiday display, I noticed movement outside. To my horror, I witnessed Karen sneaking onto my property, a determined scowl etched across her face. I couldn't believe my eyes. She was actually trying to tear down my lights. Rage just bubbled within me as I rushed outside. I caught her in the act. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" I exclaimed. Caught red-handed, Karen stammered, her face turning a shade of crimson that matched her holiday-themed sweater. I thought I saw a violation and I was just trying to help." Help? More like sabotage. I informed her that I had a security camera capturing her every move. Her plan was up, and she begrudgingly retreated, muttering something about misunderstandings and misguided holiday spirit. At this point, I'm just determined, so I took the evidence straight to the HOA president, armed with footage of Karen's attempt to sabotage my festive decor. I expected justice to be swift, but little did I know that navigating the labyrinth of homeowner association politics would be as tricky as detangling Christmas lights. The HOA president, a weary soul accustomed to mediating neighborhood disputes, watched the footage with a furrowed brow. Karen, who had mastered the art of feigning innocence, played the victim card with expert precision. "I'm just trying to make our neighborhood a better place. I am decreeing he will have to pay a fine for disrupting us and violating HOA laws," Karen insisted, her eyes wide and doe-eyed. Right now, I trusted her as much as I did Scar from The Lion King, and tonight I was Mufasa, hanging on by a thread, unlike my Christmas lights since Crazy Karen ripped them down. But whoa, wait a second. How can she even find me? What? But I just was not backing down. I pleaded my case, explaining the hours that I had spent carefully adhering to the guidelines and the unprovoked attacks on my festive spirit. The president, perhaps sensing the injustice at play, decided to take action. A week later, I received a letter from the HOA, but this time it wasn't a reprimand. It was a notice of fine, not for me, but for Karen. The president had reviewed the evidence, found her in violation of trespassing and attempted vandalism, and slapped her with a hefty penalty. I just couldn't help but smile as I read the letter. Revenge, it seemed, was as sweet as a cup of holiday cocoa and marshmallows on a chilly winter night, made even colder by Karen herself. And now she was forced to face the consequences of her actions and was suddenly silent on the neighborhood forums and conspicuously absent from any further critiques of my decorations. Hey Karen, Merry Christmas, you filthy animal. Oh man, see that's the thing, like these people will try to take advantage of you and think that you won't do anything, but when you do, they're like, oh crap, this was not in the plan. And then that is when they fall, because they're not ready for you to fight back, are they? What would have you done? HOA election overturned, posted by EdYang73. New owner in a fierce battle with an incumbent HOA board. California, city in Orange County, almost 700 homes, mostly high-end single-family homes to townhouse-style condos, so like $1 to $5 million. There have been ongoing complaints about the bullying tactic of the president for years. He controls the board, who are just yes men, 5 board members. In May 2023, he and another board member were up for election. Due to the fact that we almost never achieve quorum, 25%, we launched a stealth campaign to write in 2 candidates and then gathered ballots and proxies. The result? We had about 170 votes for our 2 candidates, 40 for president and 25 for the other incumbent. I was at the Inspector of Elections a night off when they opened ballots while others were on the Zoom call. They asked quietly if there were any nominations from the floor. They paused and then moved on. We were all confused with what that was. I asked, well, what does that mean? They said that if you didn't nominate any candidate from the floor, any write-in candidates were not valid. Thus, they disqualified all of our ballots and wouldn't even give us a count of how many we had. Naturally, we were furious. My mistake was not having a copy of the election rules handy. It wasn't until later that I read our election rules clearly allowed write-ins. Section 5.4 said that write-in candidates are permitted provided they meet the required candidate qualification, so they must be a record owner, current in assessments, and so on. Owners bombarded the property management company with complaints, so they were forced to set up a redo election coming up on October 11th. Their excuses for why they kept changing, well, they didn't nominate from the floor. They alleged some proxies looked suspicious. They blamed the Inspector of Elections for not sending all owners a proxy as required by our rules, and so on. Fast forward to today. They've done everything possible to confuse this redo election. Ballots mailed out at the very latest window required by law, which is 30 days, with some owners not receiving it. There were proxies mailed out early and separate, which confused owners. Ballots left off half the owners, mostly women. When confronted, the inspector blamed the project management company for sending them an incomplete file, but now they have a complete file. Myself, being the campaign lead and one of the candidates, have been served with violation notices coincidentally. Mine had a due date only 36 hours from when I received it. When I challenged it, they blamed it on a glitch and moved it to 45 days. A board member not up for election sent out 3 separate email blasts attacking me, not by name, viciously, and then attacking and lying about our 2 candidates, which also violates our election rules. They plan to mass email links to electronically signed proxies to all homeowners. I protested to the project management and the inspector that this is illegal. On the monthly board meeting during open forum, they wouldn't answer questions. Their attorney was on and shut me down, and then they muted me when my 3 minutes was up. So my question is, if they come up with some reason to overturn this redo election, what else can we do? Maybe file a case in small claims court and present all the evidence from the first and upcoming election, ask a judge to declare our candidates as rightful winners, if we win, which we are on track to, and then initiate a recall of all 5 board members, 3 if we win, and kick out the current 2. Do you agree with this comment? Talk to either an HOA lawyer or a lawyer with knowledge of the Davis-Sterling Act. Yeah, if they're pulling illegal things, you have a lawyer that specializes in HOA stuff, then yeah, get them. This Karen story takes place in an HOA. Immigrant Karen becomes an absolute menace to our neighborhood, posted by Ryan the Sith Lord. So for a bit of context, I live in the East Coast of the United States. I moved into a complex with an HOA. For paying the HOA, we get many benefits like free parking, free usage of the pool and the gym, and other benefits. There are way too many individual stories of the Karen to include in one post, so I'll go through the story that involves my family. My parents go to the pool for the first time a few weeks after moving in. Before they even set their stuff down, the lady, oh man, this lady. We had no idea what we signed up for. The first thing she says to them is, "Are you an owner or a renter?" "Excuse me," my dad says. They go back and forth and they introduce themselves to each other. The thing that makes her stand out among everyone else is her accent. Because I respect her privacy, I won't be saying what country she's from, and all I'll say is that she wasn't born in America, and she has an extremely thick accent. So her disputes with people can actually be somewhat funny to watch. Eventually, we became friends with her. She was very nice to us, but one fateful day, she didn't show up to the pool. This was very odd for her, as if the pool was open, well, she was there, and she was there on time. Other neighbors tell us that she was going to go get scanned as she had some sort of growth in her thyroid. She comes back, and she came back with a vengeance. After making friends with multiple different families in the complex, me and my dad would do work for them. We did handyman work for one older couple, and they loved it so much, the word got out, and now we do work for many people in our complex. Eventually, we start doing work for our immigrant neighbor. My dad and her husband negotiate what we're going to do for them, and they came up with a plan and a price. So we go there, we do our thing, and they come back and they make us do a lot more work than we bargained for. It not only tired us the heck out, but it also made us work for another 2 non-bargained hours. We were exhausted, and my dad said, "Hey, not for nothing, but all these extra things you made us build and hang were not part of our original deal." And my dad asked if they could pay us a little more. Karen leaves and asks her husband to deal with my dad. A massive argument ensues, and eventually, me and my dad just leave. Her husband told her that he threatened him, which he did not do at all. Trust me, I was there with him. She calls my dad, and they get into a huge fight on the phone, and they cut ties. Around this same time, I started making friends of my own. A boy similar to my age and his younger sister come up to me, and we started talking. Eventually, the parents all started talking, and we all became friends. The only problem is, they are really close with the Karen that we don't like. One day at the pool, she goes on a psychotic rant and starts saying really nasty crap to my parents. She was sitting at the table with the mother of my new friends, and she heard the whole thing. That day, we found out that she has anxiety because my mom goes to the bathroom after the fight and she sees her in the ladies' room crying. She comes out and apologizes on Karen's behalf. We're still friends with them to this day, but it can get complicated hanging out because they are always with her. Karen says all the negative stuff that she wants about us to them. They all just shrug it off and tell her not to talk like that. Since I hang out with my friends a lot, my friend that's my age, who I see the most, makes my mom a card for her birthday. Unbeknownst to me, he put change in the card. My mom opened up the card and gave him back the money. "Go buy yourself ice cream," my mom said to him. So we come back and his mom and Karen are talking. Karen had the absolute balls to say that my mom was rude for not accepting his money. This absolutely upset my friend's mom because she made her apologize. They show up to my house to do so. Only one problem. I didn't tell my parents about what she said, so they were in for a rude awakening when they found out the hard way. My dad was ticked and my mom was really upset. We go over to my friend's house a month later to celebrate his birthday, and both parties have a talk about that incident. As civil as they, mostly my dad, can possibly make it. Eventually, they moved out of this complex and into another one. We're all still friends and they talk to Karen still. They even come as her guests to use our pool. They want to invite us, but Karen always tells them no, going on her usual tirade. She's still a problem in this place to this day, yelling at everybody she crosses paths with. She can't go one pool day without snapping at somebody, and even my friend's parents tell her to stop as they fear she could get herself knocked out or worse. And in my state, that's a very likely possibility. For everyone accusing me of being racist, I forgot to mention that every time someone gets the upper hand on her during an argument, she screams at them even louder and accuses them of being racist. There were multiple occasions where we witnessed her pulling the race card during an argument, as she believes her nationality makes everything she does okay, but it doesn't. Let me know your bad neighbor story in the comments. I was elected on my building board after the death of a member. Median age on the board was 80. I was 40 and the building manager was around 30. Beautiful art decorated building full of very old owners. The older crowd wanted nothing to do with funding any repairs and pretty much ruled the board, but each unit that was sold was generally remodeled with younger owners, who mostly did not bother with board meetings, and there was tension. The elevator in my tier from 1938 finally completely broke and it was not easily fixable, giving me the option of walking up 8 flights of stairs or using the service elevator and riding with the garbage trolley and everyone's dogs and laundry. At the next board meeting, I was so sick of hearing fixed income from these people that had used the elevators and everything else for 40 years without ever setting money aside for eventual replacement. And one old lady, who still had a functioning passenger elevator in her tier, kept interrupting to tell us that we should just be happy to use the service elevator and to understand that residents couldn't afford any extra money. The building literally didn't have the funds to address the issue, and a 7-figure special assessment was needed. The next week, the property manager, who was also just over it all, sent out a notice that the other passenger elevator had broken and repairs were not able to be made, and that we would all be using the service elevator. She included the schedule the custodian had for garbage removal and a note that dogs would no longer be allowed on the elevator between 7:30 to 10 a.m. and 4:30 to 7 p.m. It was a mass chaos, with one creepy old service elevator for 90 apartments and people having to ride with the giant garbage can. After maybe a week or two, the service elevator, which had been modernized to not be from the 30s but still dated to 1970, stopped working. This really was an issue, leaving some people effectively stranded in their apartments. Another memo went out letting people know that repairs would take several days and that garbage pickup was suspended, asking residents to carry their own garbage down with them. An emergency board meeting was called, and a few hours before that meeting, the main pressure pump for the water failed, leaving people above the 5th floor with just dribbles of water and the inability to flush the toilets. The entire thing was just a crap show, and as the majority of the building met in the lobby, I was queasy, wondering what the heck was about to be decided. The building manager, to her credit, had her boss and her boss's boss there along with an attorney, letting the building know that the emergency funding had to be approved or they were going to cancel the management contracts and that the board was in violation of our state condo laws. One lady named Evelyn was the board president and lived on the 3rd floor and voiced her opinion that we had to let people with limited means take priority over building needs. I thought she was going to be murdered right there. We managed to halfway fix the elevator, and the experience forced the new owners to get involved with the HOA board and the elections and to attend meetings. Do you agree with this comment? This is an amazing story on so many levels. The lack of understanding about general maintenance, upkeep, and the absolute necessity of a reserve fund by some of your neighbors, and how wrong the last resident's comment is. The building needs are the needs of the residents, water, and the ability to get out. This is how something as extreme as Surfside happens. The idea that critical maintenance is a discretionary expense. It's not. If I lived in an HOA and I found out that they were putting me in danger to be cheap, oh boy, things would go crazy. What would you do? A Fitting Twist by Oscar the Grouch. Background. I had a pretty terrible childhood. Don't get me wrong, I've heard of way worse, but it was far from healthy or normal. When I was young, my parents were millionaires, my father's parents owning several of the largest businesses in the region. They divorced before I was a teenager, and both of their lives plummeted downhill. By the time I was 16, I was living on my own. Drugs, alcohol, and addiction have long since killed them both. Neither of them ever worked a job since I was a teenager. Both of them died homeless before the age of 50. Situation. I joined the military and left town without ever looking back. As more years passed, I added more and more distance, physically and mentally, from my parents. When I was 20, I learned that my mother had been arrested for stealing a large sum of money from my grandmother, who was living on her own but in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. The state ended up pressing charges against my mother because my grandmother would not. The detective told me that they had to because my mom and her POS boyfriend were, quote, fueling the criminal underground, end quote, where she lived. I was lost and shocked. I knew my mother had problems, but until this moment, I'd always viewed her as sort of a forest hippie. This is the moment that is the catalyst for my nuclear revenge. You see, my grandmother was pretty wealthy. Terrified that she would be locked away in an old folks' home, she entertained the leeching of my mother and her POS guy. The problem is that it was never enough. Even after my grandmother bought my mother a house down the street from her, she continued to rob her own mother blind. She also fed my underage sister a stream of drugs and brought her in on the con. It ultimately resulted in my mother and sister getting their first felony conviction, grand theft and check fraud, which my mother tried to pin on her own daughter, quote, because she was just a minor. A few years later, I was newly married with my first child and freshly returned from my first deployment to Iraq. We just completed another move across the country and I'm starting a new job at a new unit. I get home from work and have a strange short voicemail from my uncle, who is like the okayest guy I've ever met. It literally just says, "My mom is in the psych ward at the big hospital in her town. She left everything in your name. I'm flying back home." This is where I learned that the legal document my grandma had me sign when I was 16 made me the executor of her estate, power of attorney, and so on. My unit arranges a very generous amount of time off to fly across the country and deal with this bizarre scenario. She lived alone in this massive house. My mom had destroyed the house my grandmother bought her and then moved into my grandmother's house on the auspices of caring for her. There were so many fleas inside that contractors I hired to make repairs wouldn't go inside. Needles everywhere, and for some reason, everything was an ashtray. It was an insane thing to witness and experience. I still refused to interact with my mom at this point in my life, but now that I had the keys to the kingdom, aka access to the pot of gold, she tried to worm back into my life with renewed vigor. I always told her just to screw off. My grandmother, in the meantime, had been deemed unfit to live on her own. I was 23 with a new baby in marriage, if you remember, so I made the poor decision to put my grandmother in a nursing home. I fixed up the house, rented it to create passive income so she would not deplete her savings, and headed back home. Of course, Grandma is spicy and got kicked out of her swanky retirement home when she broke a coffee cup over some other lady's head for snooping around in her room. She was apparently wearing my grandmother's shoes when she got clocked. The same woman, a resident, had propositioned me in front of my wife when we were touring the facility. She was a different kind of the same spicy as Grandma. Her only option after the incident was a psych ward. So, my senile grandmother moved in with my family, and she lived with us for more than 5 years until her care was just out of our capability. This is about the time that I exacted my revenge. The nuclear option. When the state filed charges against my mother, way back when I was 20, part of her restitution included a lien that was placed against her property in the name of my grandmother for a little less than $100,000. Some years later, my mother had not paid her property taxes in so long that she was about to lose the house. She called me to explain that the lien would not be paid if the house was auctioned, which I knew was not true, but I saw an opportunity. I eventually worked out a deal with her. She would sign the deed over to me, and I would then sell the house and pay for her to move somewhere else. I fly to town, meet her, and sign the deed over. She expected me to use my name and credit to get her a luxury apartment. She also wanted me to buy her a new truck, and let's not forget the moving company. I rented her a U-Haul truck and got her a storage unit that I had paid for 6 months. Then, I put her and her crap head up in an extended stay for a little while. I fixed up the property and sold it to the same rental group that bought my grandmother's house shortly before. I used the money to buy annuities that enable my grandmother to live in a normal house with a live-in nurse and care at 1:4 ratio, which is amazing for her. She still might run out of money because of what my mother did, and I honestly don't know what'll happen then. She's got some years before I have to worry, and she's just shy of 100. My mother was on the street within 6 months. The last time I saw her, she looked like the crazy person who lives under a bridge, and she did at one point. She was covered in sores, balding, and methed out. She'd received a Social Security disability back payment of what would have been a significant amount for her. She died in a hospital less than 3 days later, partied herself to death. The POS dropped her off at the curb and never saw her again. I told dude I would give him some money if he gave me the key to the storage unit. Somehow, years later, she'd managed to keep it. I shared the loot with my siblings, gave POS $100, and closed that chapter of my life permanently. I mean, it literally doesn't get much worse than what happened to the mother at the end of this story. Absolutely crazy fall. I mean, what would you expect this? What do you think? Let me know. Food thieves at university got lesions from my food, posted by the man with 2 poo brains. I was reminded of this by a post somewhere else where someone asked if they could legally put laxative in their coffee creamer at work because it was being stolen. The answer was no, by the way. In the first year at university, somewhere in the west of England, I lived in a large Georgian student house which had 23 under and postgrads living in it, all lads. We had 3 kitchens, but some people would raid other fridges, and I was sick of people stealing my food. In microbiology, we were doing some experiment with an orthopox virus. Think of it as a much less severe version of cowpox, harmless enough that they let first-year students use it with only masks, gloves, and glasses. Anyway, one of my lab partners didn't use sterile techniques on her inoculating loop particularly well and ended up with a blister on her lips. She used to heat it too quickly and create an aerosol. Eventually, I was fed up with the thievery and took a little sample of said virus and added it to a block of cheese. A couple days later, the 2 perps also had a couple blister-type lesions around their mouths, which lasted a few days and meant they didn't want to go out. They had an inkling it was me, but I made some cheese on toast in front of them while ensuring I wasn't cross-contaminating, so it came away unscathed. The cheese gets hot enough to denature the virus. My food was never touched again, but I often think how risky this was. Oh, you're literally playing with fire here when you start messing with viruses, chemicals, and infecting people. Oh, this is definitely nuclear revenge, and I would be very, very careful if I was doing... I actually wouldn't do this, actually. No, I would not. This is Fits in the Baby Pool by Top Musician 7369. Okay, so this story takes place about 12 years ago. I was a manager lifeguard at a very rich neighborhood in Houston off of I-45 North. Seriously, there wasn't a house under $1 million in this whole neighborhood. Well, for those of you that don't know, summer in southeast Texas is hurricane and tropical storm season. So this particular day, a normal day of about 115 degrees Fahrenheit, the pool was rather full. In this neighborhood, there were actually 2 pools, one in front and one in back. The one in back, where I was with 4 other lifeguards, was for the kids. Now, there's a pool that goes up to about 4 feet and a separate pool divided by a water wall as the baby pool. The baby pool had a beach entrance down into it. Well, the sky was pitch black, so all the guards were watching the sky pretty closely as we scanned the pool, checking for lightning, listening for thunder. Then, there was thunder. So the rule is for every thunderclap, the pool is closed for 20 minutes. If you're 19 minutes in and it thunders, time restarts. Simple. Well, there's an iron gate on wheels that separates the pool area from the splash pad area where the kids could run through the water and whatnot. This gate was closed when everyone moved over to the splash pad to prevent the little ones from going over there. So I decided to be nice since it was only thundered once and let the kids play while the pool was closed. I was never nice again. So all of us guards were watching the kids play as we sat at a table directly across from where the kids were. Everything was going fine. Well, there was one man, we'll call him Mr. Karen, who was a regular with his wife and 2 little boys, about 4 and 6. 2 of the best behaved kids I ever dealt with. Never said a word to them about anything. Well, Mr. Karen was pacing back and forth along the outside of the splash pad talking to himself, like he was rehearsing something. All of the guards were like, what the heck is he doing? We watch him do this for nearly a full 10 minutes before he walks up to the temp guard table and he says with the most serious expression on his face, "So, exactly what part of thunder did you hear?" Yes, he really said that verbatim, y'all. And the other manager, who had just come back from his last tour in Afghanistan, said, the thunder part, sir? One of the other guards, a 17-year-old kid, dropped his face into his hand and very lightly chuckled. This grown man, 30 to 35 years old, looked at this high school kid and said, "You think that was funny?" The 17-year-old said, "Yeah, I thought that was really funny." Mr. Karen said, "Why don't we step outside of these gates and I'll show you something funny?" Army at that point stands up to his full 6-foot 4-inch frame and said, "I'm sorry, sir, I can't have you threatening my lifeguards. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now." Mr. Karen looks at us for a moment before he turns around and quite literally stomps over the iron gate, pulls it open as hard as he could, stomps into the baby pool, and by now everyone, kids, adults, his wife, are watching this display, and he throws himself down into the water, starts flailing his arms and kicking his legs and screaming at the top of his lungs, "I'm not gonna leave, you can't make me leave!" Army at this point instructed another guard to call the cops. When the cops got there, he was still throwing a fit in the baby pool, and the cops had told him that he was criminally trespassing and that he could either leave on his own or they would take him out in cuffs. He chose to leave on his own. I actually have a follow-up story to this one that occurred a few days later if anyone is interested. This is one of the richest neighborhoods I ever guarded in, and the only one that by the end of the summer, all the guards knew the cops on a first-name basis. It was absolutely ridiculous. Fits in the baby pool, part 2. Okay, so by popular demand, here's part 2 of the Mr. Karen story, starring Mrs. Karen. So I don't think I mentioned that after Mr. Karen left the pool, he was banned for the remainder of the summer. Not the kids, not the wife, just him. So a few days after part 1, Mrs. Karen and the 2 little boys come to the pool. The 17-year-old from the previous story is my head guard, and at the time when they showed up, he was checking pool tags. 17-year-old is unsure if she's allowed in because of what happened with her husband and says, "I'm standing not too far away, so I heard him clearly. 1 second, ma'am, let me make sure you can come in." He turns and walks about 3 steps toward me when I told him that she and the kids were good to come in. 17-year-old turns immediately back around and let them in the gate. The kids go into the water and Mrs. Karen sits next to the baby pool on one of the lawn chairs and pulls out her phone. Now, I'm doing chemical checks and backwashing and making sure my guards have gotten their breaks, so I'm not paying any mind to her. She's there about 15 minutes and takes the kids and quietly leaves. Still don't think anything of it. About 10 minutes later, my supervisor comes barreling into the pool like the pee-off Marine he is and starts laying into me. He's ticked and I'm confused. Finally, I'm like, whoa, you don't need to yell at me. What's going on? We are in the guard shack, which isn't a shack at this neighborhood. So supervisor tells me that the office got a call from Mrs. Karen stating that not only did we not let her and her kids into the pool, but both 17-year-old and myself cussed her out and was very rude. So now I'm peed because what, right? So I tell supervisor what happened and told him to go check the cameras if he didn't believe me, that she called the office poolside. So he did go check the cameras, saw I was telling the truth, and then Mrs. Karen also got banned for the rest of the summer. Not as exciting as the first one, but still absolutely ridiculous. I felt bad for the kids because, as I said in the other post, these were 2 very well-behaved kids and they didn't get to swim for the rest of the summer. Sue the HOA. The HOA won a $3 million claim. They owe me for house damages and won't pay. Click the video on your screen so you find out what happens to that nasty old HOA, and I'll see you there.